The morning Vera Callowell walked out of the county clerk's office with a deed still warm from the notary's stamp. She had $41 left to her name, and a piece of land that 3 different men had warned her, separately and with some feeling, was not worth the paper she had just signed. The sky above Haskell County was the color of old pewter, and the wind came off the flats in a long, indifferent gust that lifted the deed right out of her fingers and pressed it flat against the stone steps like a hand holding something down. She retrieved it, folded it twice, and pressed it into the breast pocket of her coat. Then she stood still for a moment on those steps, looking south toward ground she had not yet walked, and something moved across her face that was not quite a smile and not quite fear, and was, perhaps, the exact mix of the two that every sensible person feels when they have just done a thing they cannot undo. 3 days earlier, she had known nothing about 90 acres of burdock-choked bottomland on the south side of the Prentice Road. Then she'd seen the notice pinned to the post office board, the county's plain official language describing the parcel as having gone to tax delinquency after its last recorded owner, one Arthur Meade, had died without heirs 18 months prior. The assessed value was $412. The back taxes owed came to $278. She had $319 in a tin box under the floorboard of the room she rented from a widow on Church Street, and she had placed it there, coin by coin and bill by bill, over 4 years of washing and mending and taking in any piece of work that came her way. She had intended it for something cautious. She used it for the land instead, which meant she had spent everything except those final $41, and had acquired in exchange a property the county of Haskell had been unable to give away. She walked the acreage the following morning, boots already soaked before she reached the south fence. The burdock was as tall as her shoulder in places, great stands of it gone to dry rattling seed heads, the burrs catching her sleeves, and her hair and the hem of her coat with a democratic persistence that suggested the plant had long considered this ground its own. Beneath the burdock was clay hardpan, gray and cracked as old porcelain, and beneath that, she imagined, was the same clay running down to the creek bed that bisected the property's southeast corner. The creek itself was not much to look at, a narrow curl of brown water moving without urgency. But it ran all year. One of the county surveyors had let slip when she asked. That detail she had held quietly, like a coal banked low under ash. The burdock everyone else saw as condemnation. The creek she kept for herself. At the far end of the property, half swallowed by a stand of elderberry and 20 years of accumulated venery, was a structure she had not expected from the deed's description. It was long and low, built from the same dark limestone that lay in flat courses all across that part of the county, and its roof was tin, dented and rust-streaked, but present and mostly whole. It had been once a depot for the spur line that had serviced the small mining interest in these hills before the interest collapsed and the line was pulled up and forgotten. Someone had taken the rails, someone else had taken the iron hardware from the doors. What remained was a building 40 feet long and perhaps 18 feet deep. Its floor packed dirt, its windows boarded with planks gone the silver gray of old driftwood, and its limestone walls still plumb and solid and laid by men who had built to outlast their employers. Vera stood in the doorway and looked at the long interior for a full minute. She had the thought, not dramatic, simply factual, that this building was worth more than the land, and she walked back north in the cold, her mind already running forward. She had owned the land 3 weeks when old Henrik Sorrel came to her at the fence line, his hat in his hands, his face carrying the careful look of a man rehearsing a kindness. His farm lay to the west, a tidy 60 acres of winter wheat that he had worked since he came from somewhere in the mountains of Central Europe 40 years prior. His English was accented and precise, the way a language learned late and practiced faithfully comes to sound, slightly formal, like a letter read aloud. "You are the young woman who bought the mead ground," he said. It was not a question. She said she was. He looked past her at the burdock standing thick along the fence. "There is an old saying in my country," he told her, pressing his hat brim between his fingers. "The land does not lie. It only waits for the right question." She listened. He said, "What I am telling you is I have seen worse than this made right." Then he pointed at the creek line with his chin and said, "Keep the water," and she said, "I intend to." He nodded slowly and put his hat back on his head and turned back toward his wheat, and she understood that the conversation had been an offer of something that carried no name. In town, the verdict was delivered in the usual way, through the easy cruelty of a community too small to be discreet. At Garner's Dry Goods, the two Pelham brothers, who ran cattle on the big table ground to the north, told her within her clear hearing that a woman alone on 90 acres of waste ground would be back in her rented room by spring. They said it with the cheerful authority of men whose fathers had handed them land and who therefore understood land to be a thing conferred, not built. She bought her seed corn and her salt and her packet of fence staples, and she said nothing at all, which they appeared to find more confusing than any retort might have. Being right, she had come to understand, is its own kind of reply. It only requires patience enough to wait for it. What the Pelham brothers did not know, and what the town would not learn for some time, was that Vera had already identified the question the land had been waiting for. She had known it from the morning she'd walked the acreage, that burdock-choked clay that flooded in spring and cracked in summer and supported nothing anyone valued, was, in fact, precisely the kind of rough browse that a goat would work through like a purposeful engine. She had grown up on a farm that kept a few, watched them eat fence posts, strip bark, level thistle, clear a hillside of blackberry in a single season. A goat did not require good ground. A goat required more ground than it could finish, and an old stone building to shelter in, and water that ran all year, and a person willing to move them and watch them and keep the count. She acquired 8 does and 1 proven buck from a widow over in Pratt County who was dispersing her late husband's small herd at prices that reflected the widow's urgency and not the animal's worth. She drove them back in a borrowed wagon, the goats arranged in the wagon bed with the bored dignity of passengers who had strong opinions about the route. The county road was rough enough that one of the does managed to chew entirely through the rope she'd been tied with and stood balanced on the wagon's side rail for a full quarter-mile before Vera noticed in the mirror of a puddle's reflection and hauled the animal back by the collar. The doe regarded her with the expression of one whose excellent plan has been only temporarily interrupted. She called none of them by name, because naming 9 animals seemed to invite the kind of attachment that might slow the arithmetic. This prohibition lasted 11 days, at which point she named all 9 of them and felt better for it, and the arithmetic did not slow at all. The depot building she cleared that first week, hauling out the accumulation of elder branch and debris and the wreckage of an old wooden counter that had gone to rot. And she laid down a bedding floor of the straw she'd bought on credit from Henrik Sorrell, who appeared at her property line the first morning with a load of it on his wagon, and said only, "For the winter," and declined any immediate payment. She built a pen of used fencing wire and found cedar posts, and she ran a second wire along the creek side to keep the animals back from the cut bank. She cut the first great swaths of burdock with a long-handled hook and threw it over the fence for them to work through, and watched with a satisfaction she kept entirely to herself, as the lead doe, whom she had named Clara, put her nose into the pile and began with the focused professionalism of a crew foreman. By February, a third of the south field was measurably lower. By March, the clay beneath was visible in long strips where the goats had worked it down to bare ground, scratching and hoofing through the root mats. Vera began in those weeks to see the shape of the land under the infestation, the gentle slope of it toward the creek, the way the south-facing banks caught the afternoon light, the 3 low-lying areas where she now believed the soil ran deeper and darker than the surrounding hardpan. She noted these on a piece of brown paper with a stub pencil and did not show the paper to anyone. She did not, in those early months, discuss her plans with anyone except Henrik Sorrel, who had a way of listening to what she said and then answering the thing beneath it, which was more useful than any direct counsel she might have found. She told him in late March that she believed 2 of the low areas would grow kitchen vegetables if she could get enough organic material turned into the clay. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in his careful way, "The compost from the barn every morning, no holiday." She said she understood. He said, "And you will need 3 years before you trust it." She had not planned on 3 years, but she adjusted. The goats kidded in April, 5 of the does producing, between them, 9 healthy kids, which Vera counted 3 times in the lamplight of the depot's south end, doing the arithmetic with the pleasure of a person whose numbers have just improved. She sold 4 of the bucklings at the spring livestock day in town, declining the first offer she received from a cattle dealer named Grover Fitch, a broad, smooth-faced man who appeared at her pen with his hands in his vest pockets and the manner of someone conferring a favor. She watched him look at her animals, and she watched him decide, on the basis of some calculation she could see working behind his eyes, that she would not know what they were worth. He offered her $1.25 per animal. She said $6 the 4, which was what they were worth to anyone who had looked at them properly. He laughed, and she waited, and he left, and she sold them 2 hours later to a farm family from up near the Cimarron at $5.60 the 4, which was slightly less than she'd asked and slightly more than fair, and she was satisfied with that. A boy of about 12 named Cal Renfrew had been appearing at her fence line since March, ostensibly checking the creek for catfish, but transparently curious about the goats, and by April he had fallen into the habit of arriving each morning before school and helping her move the herd to the new sections without being asked. He had christened all 9 of the original animals a second time, overriding her names with a parallel naming system of his own devising, so that Clara became Sergeant, and the smallest doe became Pudding, and the buck, who had a quality of distant philosophical contempt for every object in his environment, became Judge. Vera told him she had already named them. Cal said he knew that, and that his names were better. She considered this and allowed it, and the result was that each animal had 2 names and answered reliably to neither, which seemed to satisfy everyone. Cal was there the morning in late May when Vera first noticed the low area nearest the creek had held its moisture 3 days after the surrounding ground had gone dry. She knelt down and pressed her fingers into it, darker soil, a different texture, nearly loamy, and looked up at Cal, who was watching her with the focused attention of someone who has learned that the quiet moments are the ones worth watching. She told him nothing was wrong. She told him she needed him to remember this spot. He said, "The good dirt." She said yes, and marked it with a short stake, and by July she had turned 20 bushels of goat compost into it, and planted a test row of beans that came up strong and went on to produce with an abundance that she harvested and stored without saying anything to anyone in town for the remainder of that summer. It was in August. August arrived that year like the open door of a furnace, a heat that flattened the prairie grass and turned the roads to powder and cracked the well casings on 2 of the table ground farms to the north, that the drought made its full declaration. The Pelham brothers' cattle began dropping weight. The winter wheat across the county was a loss. The creek on Vera's property ran narrower but ran, and her deep-rooted burdock, what remained of it, held moisture in the clay for longer than the exposed ground of the surrounding farms. The goats browsed and endured. The beans in the low area came on. What the drought stripped from the county, it stripped unevenly, as hardship tends to do, falling hardest on those who had borrowed against their surplus and lightest on those whose expectations had never grown larger than what their ground could actually bear. Vera's $41 had become, through the months, a different and more interesting arithmetic. She had sold the bucklings, sold the surplus bean harvest, to a hotel cook in town who had come out to the farm in September following a second-hand report from a peddler who'd tasted the beans at Vera's fence line and driven directly to the hotel to describe them with an enthusiasm disproportionate to the subject, which is the proper response to a very good bean. The cook, a broad woman named Mrs. Patel, who wore her authority like a clean apron, came out in a rented buggy, tasted one raw from the vine, and said she would take everything Vera could supply and would send her kitchen boy every Saturday, and would Vera consider wintering the goatherd through and selling her the milk in spring, because she had noticed the goats and had her own opinions about fresh milk. Vera said she would. Mrs. Patel tasted a second bean, nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose investment has confirmed itself, and drove back to town. This was the arrangement that changed the arithmetic in a way Vera had not quite projected, which meant she had not been conservative enough. She sat in the depot building that evening, the lamplight on her paper, and redid the sums 3 times because they kept coming out larger than she expected. They came out the same each time. She folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket and went to check the count on the herd, and they were all present, and she stood in the doorway of the old stone building listening to them move in the straw, and the feeling she had was not triumphant. It was, instead, the quiet feeling of a person who has done the work and waited for the work to be enough. Grover Fitch began appearing at the county assessor's office in October. Vera learned this from Henrik, who had a way of knowing things without appearing to seek them out, and who came to her fence with the news wearing the expression of a man carrying a stone. The county had reassessed several properties in the area on the grounds of agricultural improvement, which was within their legal right and which, in ordinary years, was unremarkable. But the drought had made the assessor's office busy with the accounts of failing farms, and it was Fitch who appeared to be directing the assessor's attention. He was, it emerged, interested in acquiring several parcels, including Vera's 90 acres, through a mechanism not unlike the one through which she had acquired it, tax default. He had been telling people, in the manner of a man sharing a private concern, that a young woman alone simply could not manage a working property through a drought year, and that it was a shame, really, and that someone ought to do something. He was prepared, he suggested, to do something, in the form of an offer he claimed to have made her directly, and had rejected, which was not quite true. The offer at the livestock pen had been for her animals, not her land, but the way he told it, the two blurred together. Vera heard this account third-hand on a Tuesday. She sat with it for a day and a half without saying anything, which was her method. She counted what she had. She counted what she owed. She counted what the property now produced and what it would produce in the spring. The numbers, as she had confirmed 3 times in September, were sufficient, more than sufficient. But she needed the assessment to reflect what the land actually was now, rather than what it had been when Arthur Meade left it to weeds and back taxes. She walked to Henrik's farm on the Thursday morning and asked him to come with her the following Monday when she went to speak to the assessor, because she knew the weight of a neighbor's account and she knew the weight of Henrik's particular word in that part of the county, and she was not too proud to know the difference between doing a thing alone and doing it well. Henrik was at her fence before dawn on Monday. He had brought, without comment, a ledger book in which he had written out, in his careful European hand, a record of the acreage she had cleared, the improvements she had made, and the production figures she had described to him over their fence-line conversations, none of which he had appeared to be recording at the time. The sight of it moved her in a way she did not show, because it meant he had been believing in her long before the numbers made it easy. The assessor was a tired-looking man named Wade, who had been dealing with defaulted farms since July and wore the expression of someone doing long division in his head at all times. Grover Fitch was already in the office when they arrived, which meant he had been told or had guessed, and he stood with his hands in his vest pockets in the way of a man who believes the room belongs to him by disposition, if not by deed. When Vera laid Henrik's ledger on the desk and placed beside it the hotel contract with Mrs. Patel's signature and the sale records from the livestock day and the water survey she had requested and paid for herself, a document confirming the year-round creek, Fitch's manner shifted in the small, involuntary way that a person's face moves when something they expected has not arrived. He covered it quickly, turning to Wade with a smooth sort of concern, suggesting that records could be made to say anything and that what mattered was the county's interest and whether a lone property holder could be considered a reliable, long-term steward of improved land. Wade looked at the records for a long time. Then he looked at Vera. "How many head of goat?" he asked. She said 31. He said 31. She said yes. He looked at Fitch, and there was something in his look that was not quite accusation and not quite amusement, but lived in the neighborhood of both. "How many acres cleared?" he asked. She said 62, with work ongoing. He turned the pages of Henrik's ledger. Then he said, with the careful neutrality of a man who has reached a conclusion and is giving it the dignity of procedural language, the assessment will reflect actual present use. He looked at Fitch. "The property is not in default." Fitch said, "Wade, I think we should." And Wade said, "I think we are finished," which was the most authority Vera had heard the man express in the 4 times she had been in his office, and the room was done. In the hallway, Fitch stopped beside her. He said, in a lower register now, the smooth warmth gone and something colder underneath, that the county road came within 20 yards of her south fence, and that road easements could be reviewed. He said it the way a man says a thing he wants to be heard, but not repeated, the private kind of pressure. She looked at him for a moment. She said, "The depot building on the south end of my property is on the original spur line survey, and the survey records are in the county clerk's office and have been since 1891, and I have read them twice." She said this plainly, without performance. His face changed again, and this time he did not cover it. He went out the front door, and she and Henrik went out the side, into the pale October light. Henrik was quiet as they walked. Then he said, "You knew about the survey." She said she had looked at it the day she bought the property. He made a small sound that was partly a laugh and partly something else entirely. He said, "You are not what they think." She said, "I know what I am." And he said, "Yes, and so does the land." By the 3rd week of November, the town had begun to understand, in the slow, resistant way that towns understand the things they have been wrong about, that something different had happened on the south side of the Prentice Road. The hotel had begun serving a goat milk dish that Mrs. Patel had apparently designed specifically to make people ask where the milk came from, which they did, and then went quiet when told, because it meant the ground everyone had called waste was producing the best thing on the menu. The beans were spoken of separately. There were people who came to Vera's fence line in November under the pretext of various errands and stood there in the cold, looking at the cleared ground, at the long, low depot building that they now understood to be a barn and a workroom both, at the goat herd moving across the scrubbed clay in their philosophical way, and at the person who had done it, a young woman alone, which was the thing they had told themselves made the whole enterprise impossible, and which turned out, as with so many confident predictions, to require a fundamental revision. The Pelham brothers came in December, not together. That would have required a unity of purpose that the circumstance didn't quite allow, but separately within the same week, each one finding a different reason to appear at her fence. The first, Thomas, the elder of the two, wanted to know if she had any surplus hay to sell, because their cattle were short and the drought had wiped out their stored forage. She said she had some. She named a fair price. He looked at the price for a moment with the expression of a man who would have preferred it to be different, and then nodded and paid it and loaded his wagon. And she watched him go with the feeling that she had, in not naming an unfair price, done something that cost her a little and mattered more than the money. The younger Pelham, James, came 3 days later about the goats. He had heard, he said, that she was breeding a good milk animal. He was not wrong. She showed him what she had. He asked the price on a pair of bred does for the spring. She gave him the same number she had given Mrs. Patel, which was honest and not punitive, because what she understood, and what the drought had clarified for the county generally, was that a person who holds the surplus in a scarce year holds something more than an advantage. They hold a choice, and the choice is the only part that really belongs to them. James Pelham looked at the does and looked at her and said, "I said some things at Garner's," and she said, "I know." And he said, "I was wrong." And she said, "The does will be ready in March." And they shook on it, and he left. Being right is its own kind of reply. It only requires patience enough to wait for it, and the grace, when it arrives, to let it stand without rubbing anyone's face in it, because the town still has to be the town you live in after the score is settled. Henrik came for Christmas dinner because she had invited him, and because he had no one, and because she had learned that generosity, like the compost, works best when it is consistent and unannounced. Cal Renfrew came too, with his mother's permission, and a slightly too large hat that he wore with great seriousness, and he spent the first hour checking on the goats and renaming 2 of the kids that had been born in the fall, and then came inside and ate an amount of food that Vera considered remarkable for someone his size, and afterward sat by the depot building's small iron stove with the comfortable silence of someone who has come to feel that a place belongs to him in some way that cannot be deeded, but is nonetheless real. Henrik raised a cup of the cider she had pressed from the elder trees that grew thick along the property's north edge. She had come to understand in October that this was the other thing the land had been waiting to tell her, and she had harvested the elderberries in September without telling anyone, and pressed them into a cider that was dark and tart and very good. And he said, "The land does not lie." He said it looking not at her, but at the old limestone walls of the depot, the firelight catching the cut stone, the goats audible behind the partition she had built to divide the building into shelter and workroom. She said, "It only waits for the right question." He nodded. They drank. Outside, the wind moved through the cleared ground in a clean, unobstructed way. It had not been able to move before, when the Burdock stood shoulder high and the land kept its secrets in the dark. Spring came early to Haskell County and came with rain, and it found Vera Callowell's 90 acres in a state of transformation so complete that the returning warmth seemed almost to be agreeing with her. The south field clear and deep furrowed now, and planted with the kitchen garden she had promised herself in the first March. The creek running full and steady along its cut bank, the depot building sound, and warm and full of the kind of purposeful animal noise that means a herd is growing instead of declining. She had 41 goats by April. She had a contract with the hotel. She had a second informal contract with 3 families in town who came each Saturday for milk. And these families included, in a development that she had received without comment but with some private satisfaction, the family of the younger Pelham brother, whose wife had come herself the first Saturday and said she had heard the milk was good, and Vera had said, "It is," and handed her a clean jar of it, and the woman had tasted it there at the fence line with the direct, unself-conscious appraisal of someone who has raised children and knows what good food is and cannot be talked into or out of that knowledge. And she had said, "Yes, it is," and that had been that. The property was assessed in April at a value that reflected what it had become, and Vera paid the taxes on it from her operating account without touching the reserves she had begun to rebuild. She had, at that point, looked at the remaining uncleared 30 acres on the north edge and begun the calculation for the following year. The burdock there had reseeded in the parts she hadn't reached, but she looked at it with the familiarity of a person who has spent a year learning a thing's habits and knows it can be worked. She looked at it the way someone looks at a problem they have already solved, from the useful distance of the present, and began to count. Cal was at the fence, as he usually was on Saturday mornings, having adopted the schedule of the milk customers with a flexibility that suggested he had decided the farm's rhythms were now also his rhythms. He was watching the herd in the north field, doing the silent count that he had picked up from her without being taught, and when he finished, he said, 42. She said, 41. The gray-faced doe had been counted twice. She was close to the fence. He looked again and admitted the arithmetic, and then said, "What's in the north field next?" She told him she was thinking of it. He said, "The burdock." And she said yes. He said, "Judge would go through it in a week." And she said, "The whole herd would go through it in a season if she managed them right." And he said, "Can I help?" And she said, "You already do." And that was enough. And they stood together looking at the land that had been called waste by everyone who had ever looked at it except the one person who had looked at it properly, and the morning light came across the cleared ground in the long, level, generous way of a spring that has been preceded by a hard winter, and has therefore earned the right to be golden, and the goats moved through it in their careful, unhurried way, eating down what was in front of them and making room, acre by acre, for what would come next. The land does not lie. It only waits for the right question. And the right question, as it turned out, had never been whether the ground was good. It had been whether the person standing on it was willing to stay long enough to find out.